Welcome to the CentralReach ABA On-Call podcast.
We do insist upon quick reinforcement.
Thought-provoking conversation, ideas, and trends in the applied behavior analysis industry.
With this type of arrangement of material, you can learn the same amount in about half the time with half the effort.
Now, here are your hosts, Drs. Rick Kubina and Doug Kostewicz.
Welcome, everyone, to Episode 7. Today we're going to talk about ABA and its application to adult learning. I am joined by my trusty co-host, Dr. Douglas Kostewicz, and we have a special guest, Dr. Shannon Hill. Dr. Hill, who I'm going to call Shannon, and of course Doug, who I always call Doug. Shannon is a colleague of mine at CentralReach, and she has great experience working with adults. She has worked with adults with disabilities. She has worked with adults without disabilities. She's consulted in schools. She's applied behavioral principles throughout all of these different places, and we are just thrilled to have her here and to talk about adult education and ABA.
Well, thank you. It's exciting to be here, Rick.
Well, why don't we just jump right into it? Our first topic is, what is adult education, where is it occurring, and how does this relate to ABA? So both of you have experience working with adults, so what's your thought on that?
Well, my thought is that ABA applies everywhere. And so in teaching, for example, undergrads, that's where I really started kind of thinking about this, because it seems odd that we would be teaching principles of learning and not using those learning principles when we're teaching them, like at the undergraduate level and all. So I was kind of troubled that I had a habit of delivering my instruction in a lecture format without a whole lot of follow-up. They're listening for long periods of time. Some of them who are intrinsically interested in the information are getting reinforced because they like what they're hearing and they like participating in the discussions. But a lot of them are just sitting in the background waiting on it to be over with. And so that's when I really started thinking about it as a university professor, but then also as we are trying to train our workforce, especially with this RBT training or doing CEUs in an online format.
Certainly, I can relate to what you're saying. I've spent a lot of years in higher education, and I try as much as I can to apply ABA into the area. And one of these days, I'd like to fully just see what does if you were leveraging all of the power of what we know we can do in most of the class, what would that look like? A lot of people do try to get the adults more actively responding, and maybe there's some kind of reinforcement procedure in there, or maybe there's something else. But I think we're really, how I say this diplomatically, we probably haven't done as much as we could do in higher education.
Yeah, I think there's that fallacy. We talk about experts in the field, and we're experts to some extent, obviously, in applied behavior analysis. But just because we're experts in applied behavior analysis doesn't necessarily mean that when you're in those teaching formats, you're implementing those techniques. Sometimes they don't generalize. As with you, Rick, I try to use those techniques. I try to keep kids engaged. However, they have a long history of being talked to, and we know that that's not always the most effective way to teach individuals, especially adults, but any individual, through straight didactic instruction.
And one of the things that you just said, Doug, kind of resonates a lot with me, because one of the big eye-opening times for me was when I started teaching like in a community college setting or with students who are at a four-year university, but they're non-traditional students who did not have a really strong learning history with academia, maybe had developed some real negative histories with that, actually. And drawing a parallel to that work that I was doing with people who were working in schools, maybe paraprofessionals, or working in developmental centers or group homes, who had a lot of similarities where if it seemed too academic-y, I know that's probably not a great word, but if it came across that way, then they were tuning out. And of course, they did a lot better when we started doing role plays and we started actually just using a more rapid reinforcement schedule, a more dense reinforcement schedule. But it also brought up, what are those reinforcers that they are looking for? What actually can we use that's not patronizing but is motivating?
It's interesting you said that, because I have a variety of cohorts that I work with. Some have come straight out of undergrad. Some have come back to teaching through other methods. But they're not fully non-traditional, but there are students that have been out in the field. And I share those exact experiences. My younger students, meaning when I say younger, we're talking master students coming right out of undergrad, they don't enjoy any type of non-traditional. They want the traditional lecture. They don't engage as often in these because they don't have any history with them. But as soon as they have the experience in the field, they're almost a lot more available and accepting of other ways, and are usually very exhausted when they come to me and I end up lecturing it all. So it's interesting that we're starting to see those similar patterns.
Yeah, it is. And then there's so much now for online learning, whether it's in a college course or so many CEUs are now online. And of course, all of these RBT courses are online. So when I got challenged to develop a 40-hour course, I wanted to bring in all of the information, things that I had observed in the classroom, and then my own frustrations with taking coursework online and knowing the ways that I was kind of skating around the edges with that. You know, because some of the things that we need to do to make it more behavior analytic, of course, take a lot more energy from the person who's developing the coursework.
Yeah.
So,
I'm looking at the BACB website right now, and I see that we have, these are the most recent numbers, 36,106 BCBAs, 3,747 BCABAs, and then 66,336 RBTs. Although those numbers are eye-popping, what also is eye-popping, which is not on here, are the rise of all of these college courses. And these college courses are being done by us, by people that have BCBAs and are PhDs. So this is such a wonderful opportunity for us to not just preach, but to actually do all of these things that our science says helps people learn, helps people enjoy what they're doing, and really derive a lot of, the maximum benefit from the content instruction that's provided to people.
Absolutely. And now with the tech tools are just constantly growing, and the ability to be able to do interactive learning and to give people automatic feedback. It's almost a second job for the behavior analyst who's developing that, because you really got to have your thumb on the pulse to know what is available to be able to do the things that you envision doing. One of my favorite things that we did with the 40-hour RBT course was listen to the people who were giving us feedback on the testing components, because in 40 hours of coursework, by the time they get to the end, they've forgotten what happened in the first course. And so just little things that we can do that are similar to what we do in sessions with kids. And we're resampling those questions from past courses and really being able to make sure that by the time they get to the end, if they have this test anxiety concept going on too, that should be coming down as well, because they have been re-exposed to that information. So we're trying to move them from acquisition through generalization by application questions, and then maintenance by repeating those questions as we move through new material as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is no doubt we have a golden opportunity in front of us.
Yes, absolutely.
Our second topic dives a little deeper into specific examples of using ABA techniques in the adult classroom. And one thing that really comes to mind, Rick, I'm sure you remember these and I'm sure you use these, is incorporating guided notes. So you have this lecture, you have something that may not promote a lot of active student responding, but the students are always responding because they're engaged in your lecture. And you can walk around and see where they are answering questions and what they're gathering from the lecture at hand.
Yeah. So Shannon, and to other people, we've mentioned this before, Doug and I both came through Ohio State together, and that is the capital of guided notes. I mean, there have been so many studies done there, and there were some professors, some faculty that studied guided notes. So guided notes has this huge history, and it falls in line with how can we get people to be more active. There's passive learning, which just means you're sitting there listening to the professor go on about whatever they're talking about, whereas active learning would be you actually have people doing things, and with guided notes, the professor would outline what they want to talk about, and then maybe there's something that's left open, and the notes that they have wouldn't have, there'd be a blank there, and then the professor would show it, and then everyone would write it down. And the results from the research show that it helps people retain information for longer periods of time, and the social validity behind it's also good, that people actually like to be doing things.
So it gives them something to do while they are listening to you that is productive, and keeping them focused on what you perceive to be the most important parts of your lecture, I presume.
Yeah.
Not only that, what we find is, and I think you alluded this in the first part, is not everybody knows how to take notes.
That's right.
Not everybody knows what's the most important thing. I've worked with people who try to write everything down verbatim, and that is not the best way to bring knowledge, retain knowledge, and bring it back to someone. So this just allows a highlight. It allows someone to remain engaged. They have to continue to listen. They have to continue to watch. So it's one way to keep them engaged, and also to filter information to them. That's very important. Another thing that at least I do in my classes, is I'm constantly probing with questions. Mm-hmm. So I have students, there'll be multiple choice, and so they all have to stick up a hand of 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on how many choices there are. So there's always this, okay, we went over a couple points. Now let's ask a couple questions. Where are they at? Okay, let's go to the next one. So it's another way that I've been trying to keep students involved in the lecture, responding, especially when it's hard. You want to end up lecturing because you've got a lot of information to get across.
I do have a solution this semester for that problem, and it's worked pretty well for me. And that is that I have brought in a BCBA student that is accumulating hours under me, but he comes to class with me about once a month, and he collects data on me. What did I say I wanted to do in terms of scaffolding instruction, responding to questions where they clearly just want me to fill in the blanks for them, when I know that if I can phrase the questions correctly, I can pull that information out of them. But sometimes it's just so much easier to just give that answer. So the part that has been helpful is knowing that he is there, he is collecting data, and he's showing me at the end of the night how many times I provided the answer versus pulled it out of them, and did I follow the prompting procedures that I said I wanted to at the beginning of the class.
A little bit of uncomfortable silence always gets kids to answer something. I always find if I just wait long enough, someone's going to say something.
Right. Everyone's uncomfortable, but, they get used to that. I have found that this class, this semester where I've really committed to it, has been the most fun for me and actually the most fun for them. And the most reinforcing part of it for me is I've had students come to me between classes and say, I recommended something that we did in our class to another professor. And I was like, well, maybe they all hate me now, but it really makes me feel like we're on the right track if they're trying to take it into other classrooms as well.
I feel that our science has done so much in higher ed, which in working with adults, a lot of people don't realize, turning the clock back and looking at personalized instruction, that was huge and it still happens to today, but people call it something different so they can have their own inventions. But how information is structured and how we reinforce, like oftentimes, if you think about how do universities work, it's almost like one big token economy, and you do these things and here's your points along the way or whatever time frame it happens. And at least when we're in the class, if there are ways that we can increase the density of reinforcement, or just in some cases just have the density of have reinforcement there, that's going to produce good things.
Yeah, and broaden the definition of the reinforcer so that it's not just about getting through this or getting the points that I need in order to pass the class, but to actually have the learning itself become reinforcing to them.
Yeah, I also think, so we have, when we cover ABA and discuss it, there certainly is a whole host of techniques that we can apply in the classroom, but I go back to my very first job, and that I was a professor at, it wasn't Penn State, it was at another university, and there was a student who was a first-generation student. Student was struggling with drugs and alcohol, missing classes, and I happened to be the advisor of this student, and I'm new, and guess what we did for that student? We had a contingency contract. That might seem like it's something that, you're going to do this with young children, but it works for adults too. And that the contract, fortunately for this individual, the way we lined it out, we set it up so that it wasn't this punitive document that said, you do this or this bad thing is going to happen. It was written in a way that was very effective and had a good ending. That person made it through the semester and ended up graduating.
Wow. So was there self-monitoring in that, or were the instructors helping? Yeah,
there were a lot of checks in there, so the person had to check in and do certain things. And there was data that was generated across time, and it laid out if these things don't happen, here's what the consequences would be.
I think that, of course, seeing those graphs move in the right direction is something that the students seem to like as well. I'm really wanting to look at how we can incorporate that into our online learning as well. Not just that you have progressed through it, here's all the dots, here's how far you have gotten through this coursework, but here are the concepts that are embedded here, and look at what parts that you are doing really well in and what parts you're struggling with, so that they can go back and kind of tailor their learning for the parts that they're struggling with. and pat themselves on the back when they see those graphs move.
Yeah. We have been talking, three of us happen to have a lot of experience in higher education, but I would point out in terms of, if you go to the BACB, they have a really nice graph that shows the areas of practice. And I'll just read off some. Non-university research, corrections and delinquency. Think about what could happen in corrections, public policy and advocacy, sports and fitness, behavioral gerontology. I'll just stop right there. There are so many things that we can do in those areas. And, of course, when I look at this graph, it's really small in terms of the number of people that practice in those areas. But nevertheless, as those areas grow, so too will behavior analysis. For this last segment, I want to talk about something that when a lot of people think, well, adult education, what can you do? This is something that probably most everyone has experience with, and that is SAF meds. Shannon and Doug, you two have had experience with SAF meds. Share some of your SAF med stories and tell us, what do you think about them?
Well, full disclosure, I am not a PT trained person. I'm completely self-learning, and but SAF meds is something that is so easy to understand how to do that and what the value of it is, and then just to see it happen. So I incorporated it into the class that I'm teaching this semester, which is, again, those non-traditional adult learners. And that has been the number one thing that has, I think, made a difference for them in this course, because it's so easy for them to do. They see that immediate result, and they are impressed with themselves about how much they are retaining as they move forward in the course. So it's been perfect for what we were doing.
I think the really nice thing about SAF meds is it's able to bring the power of frequency building as a learning component to adult learners. It's easy to think about younger children and doing such as repeated readings or doing letter sounds and using frequency building to build them to fluent levels. It doesn't translate as well working with adults. However, SAF meds allows an opportunity to build to fluency this rapid practice that you can incorporate a variety of different materials, but it uses that power and builds them from where they maybe have mastered the material and are then moving towards generalizing that to other settings, bringing that and applying it to other settings, but then they can take that material and become fluent with it. And I think that's probably the most important aspect. It's an acceptable way to have that rapid practice and demonstration of behavior.
Right, and it can be completely self-contained. It's something that they are learning. A lot of times it's the pronunciation of some of the words that we use in, whether we're talking about behavior analysis or psychology proper or whatever. Sometimes those words are stumbling blocks for people, even how to pronounce them. And being able to go through that on their own makes them practice that in the privacy of their home, so that when they come to class, they are less afraid to speak out because they are more confident that they have that language down.
That's a really good point. There's just so many studies that can be done. I would love to see that as your frequency with the SAF med content increases, do you also see these concomitant increases in talking about things and writing about things?
Yeah, it would be a really good study. I would, all I can tell you is anecdotally what I'm observing in my own learners, but I would love to see that.
Doug, get on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I was thinking about something else, and okay, I didn't know I had a.
I just tasked you with something.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go.
And SAFMEDS is another thing that's really easy to incorporate into online learning as well. So we have vocabulary words built in, and I've made sure to try to write them in a way that they translate easily into SAFMEDS if the students want to use them that way. But it's kind of low-hanging fruit to give them that terminology in that way.
Yeah, I'd like I'd like to revisit something you said at the very beginning, and that is this originated in precision teaching, but you don't have to be a precision teacher to use it. In fact, you don't need to know anything about precision teaching to use it. We certainly, people that advocate for precision teaching would say, hey, it would be great if you're putting this on a standard acceleration chart, but this technology, it's not flashcards. That SAFMEDS stands for something very specific. Say off fast minute, every day shuffled. And that acronym, which probably should be changed a little bit because you don't have to do it for a minute. You could do it for 20 seconds or 30 seconds. But that technology has proved to be so powerful in generate great learning, and there's lots of research behind it that now you see it spreading across universities. I even see some people in psychology that aren't even behavior analysts who are picking up on SAFMEDS.
Yes, and we're not talking about this so much today, but in public schools as well, because there's been less emphasis on memorization. My son, when he's a senior now, but when he was in second and third grade, they didn't do the mass choral multiplication, addition, subtraction facts. They did it in different ways, and the only way he learned it was just having a mom who made him do it the old-fashioned flashcard drill way. But that addition with the SAFMEDS of the charting, whether you're doing it the correct way on the SCC or you're doing it with a regular graph, as long as you've got that aim line there and they see that and they know I need to change what I'm doing if I'm not hitting that aim, I think it just translates to so many different settings. And people, if we can do that, if we can get our component skills drilled into the kids in public schools earlier, then hopefully when they come into my college classroom, these kinds of skills aren't so new to them.
I also like that SAFMEDS gives, so you mentioned students responding. When I was using it, I responded to it, but it shows the power of when you are fluent with something. And as we are teaching people to implement behavior analysis and we are conveying all this knowledge, just them experiencing that, it may incorporate how we can take this notion of frequency building and then fluent displays of behavior, incorporating that not just in the form of SAFMEDS, but moving forward as they work with other students with special needs, or they're teaching other behavior analysts or RBTs or whoever. They can begin to use these techniques and understand the role of what actually happens when you hit these performance criteria that are so powerful.
And it's a great thing for special education teachers and inclusion teachers when we've had students who were struggling in fifth grade because they never really learned basic math facts. And to give that to those inclusion teachers during the time that they're doing their pull-out services and them see, oh, wow, that didn't take a lot from me, and it really did a lot. And we have seen them actually taking that and using it in different ways as well. So it's really self-perpetuating.
I also know of people who have their own agencies, and what they report is they'll use SAFMEDS to help their RBTs learn not only more content than they would have just from the RBT courses, but also procedural knowledge. It's easy to think about how do you create a deck and have something where someone's going to spit back some information. But if you are good with SAFMEDS, it's not just factual recall you're getting at. You can teach concepts. You can teach more advanced rules to people and give people a much richer understanding of whatever that particular topic is. And I'll see that and hear about that from people who have agencies that are having their RBTs and even their BCBAs learn content through SAFMEDS.
Well, that is awesome, and I need to be reading and hearing about that. So the RBT course that we just finished is meant to be a living, breathing thing. So as we're getting feedback and new ideas, we want to continue to make it as behavioral and as reinforcing to the learners, and of course to have good outcomes with it. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I'll have to steal some ideas maybe.
Well, Doug and Shannon, we've said it all. This was a wonderful podcast talking about ABA and adult education, and I'd specifically like to thank you, Shannon, for joining us on ABA On Call.
Well, thank you for having me. I had a really great time.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you for the next episode of ABA On Call.
Thank you for listening to the CentralReach ABA On Call podcast with Drs. Rick Kubina and Doug Kostewicz.
This is verbal behavior, and
You can find the show notes for this episode on centralreach.com/ABA On Call. Please stay connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by following @CentralReach and subscribe on the podcast player of your choice.